Hi everyone! Are you here to talk about software packaging and deployment? Well, you're at the right spot. Hi, I'm Michael from Pixeesoft. If we're just meeting, this is our developer show. We're in the middle of a sprint of our fourth sprint when we're migrating an existing application from bare metal to cloud. Yesterday we had the very first stand-up in the sprint, and I outlined the problems, the challenge that lies ahead, being the notifications. The notifications are developed in era of before Firebase notifications, and so everything is done manually. I had some, let's say, unknown in the application, but I think I have quite cool things to report. So let's jump into the Scrum board. So right here, you see the two tasks: create container for notification proxy and deploy notification proxy. And as you see that there are two definitions of done, right? Dockerfile in Bitbucket Git repo, that's obvious, yes, if it's supposed to be running in the Docker container. Naturally, you need to have your Dockerfile there, right? And located all hard-coded constants. This is really important for any future development, because if we are to deploy it in the cloud and we want to scale it, sometimes some hard-coded constants might be a blocker. It might be an issue, because let's say that you hard-code an IP address of one of the components. Well, how would you horizontally scale that if the other component would talk to the one on that one specific IP address? So this is a problem that needs to be addressed. Now, these things are fairly easily solvable nowadays because we're running on Kubernetes, and you can inject these services on start of the container. You just have to handle the injection of that set property into the container that's starting. So how would that work? Well, let's say that we have the data eater and the data feeder. And once we start the feeder, we can then take the name of the service and inject it into the other one. Now, this would do that it would pass on the dynamic address of the load balancer, given that you're, of course, passing the service or node port. But it would be there dynamically as you start the app. It wouldn't be baked into the code, because that, let's say, is not really flexible. And if it's hard-coded for bare metal and then I hard-code it for cloud, well, I'm not really solving any problem, am I? So I needed to locate them. And that's what I did. Located them and created the container. That was fairly straightforward, done and done. And then deploying notification proxy. That came with two definitions of done. README in the deployment folder. Yes. Why? Well, you need to document all of those hard-coded constants. You need to put them in, make sure that no one ever forgets about them. Sure, you can say, oh, but I added a comment. But that's not enough, because that has a prerequisite that you go into the code and you actually know where to go in the code. In order to know where to go in the code, you have to have a documentation for it, and preferably a very thorough documentation, not necessarily a documentation that begins how to read this documentation, but let's say that a documentation where you have the description of the most crucial parts, being constants, the way it's deployed, the way it behaves, and the way it talks and depends on other services. I think that these things should be described outside of the code. Sure, little caveats, little things regarding an algorithm, that can be in the code, that can be in the method itself, given it's not a method of 3,000 lines, but then you have a completely different problem. What I mean is that some things belong to the documentation of the code and some things belong outside. And I think that the constants and the hard-coded things in the code should be documented. Not only it's a technical debt thing, but also I might just forget about it. Let's say I open it, I don't know, 2 months down the line, and I need to make some adjustments, and then I need to slowly train the thought again and be like, oh, that's where it was. So that's the reason it needs to be documented. Anyway, these two things, done and done. Moving on. Today, another day, 1.0, right? So we need 2 medium or a large. Well, I think that I'm just gonna go in the order here, create a container for URL test server, and deploy URL test server. In fact, these two things have the very same definition of done. So let's just add it there, definition of done, copy items from create container, add, there it is. And the same thing, add here, definition of done, and deploy notification proxy. There it is. Same two things, basically the same deployment. I have a funny feeling that, in fact, these two should be fairly identical to the one before, to the notification proxy. And what is the URL test server, you might ask? Well, that is that, as I said, the whole system works with edge devices and provides real-time data for the customers and intelligence on top of those edge devices data. Create container for URL test server. The URL test server is a service when you add an edge device, it tries to ping the device because you add its IP address or any other form that it communicates with our backend. And you add that communication, and what this does is that it tries to ping that address or ping that endpoint and asks, are you there? And do you communicate on the protocol that we have defined? And it either returns true or false, but this is very crucial for the front end, because the front end, when you put in your edge device, I am putting in this edge device, this method or this service is called by the front end saying, should I even bother adding this? And it performs the URL test, returns the answer, and then the front end says, okay, I will put this into the database. Well, it's not the front end that does that, but it's the functionality of the front end. It calls this URL. If it's successful, then it calls another, our API server, and adds the device into the database. And that's pretty much it. And in fact, I think that the URL test server has the very same dependencies as the notification proxy. So it really should be copy-paste, requirements.txt, same Docker file, copy over, run it, deploy it. I even think that these two things combined might take only a half a day. I'm not sure, but I will say it is possible. And if it is the case, then I will probably deploy either the object storage or the Mongo service. I would try to take one of these things because they're medium. I would not start working on this. However, these things are actually not completely linear. I can just take one at a time and work on containerizing the various cron jobs that needs to be Dockerized. But that's pretty much it. I'll take a look. No questions in the chat, but feel free to comment at any point after the video. And as I always say, stand-ups should be brief and to the point. So that's for the stand-up. No more mindless talking. I did have a colleague at my previous job a couple of years ago that would go and talk on for 30 minutes at the stand-up to the point that we had to say, oh, look, we need to move on. If you're watching, I forgive you. I'm not gonna babble along for much longer. Anyway, that's all for me. Thank you for watching. Subscribe if you haven't already. Share this video with your friends. Why not? I mean, if it brings you value, maybe it would bring value to them as well. Hit the bell so that you can be online when we're online and you can ask in the chat. And check out our blog, pixeesoft.blog. We post regularly, not only regarding our plannings and reviews, but also a weekly change log. So do take a look at it if maybe you don't want to binge watch all of the videos and just read the post. So check that out. And That's it. A long weekend is coming. I don't think that there's going to be a stand-up on Monday, but there's definitely going to be one on Tuesday. So I'll see you then on our next daily scrum.